Hi, everyone. My name is Andy, and today I'll be talking about a different way to think about the LSM tuning problem via our system, Endure. This work was done jointly with my colleagues and, most importantly, friends, Harshal, Evimaria, and Manos. All of us are fellow members of Boston University. I hope by the end of this talk, you'll know exactly what workload uncertainty is and how you may incorporate this into your own database or data system tuning issues. So let's take a look at LSM trees first. Over the last decade and plus some, we've essentially seen a pretty large influx in the usage of log-structured merge trees, or LSM trees for short. This is mainly due to the various tuning knobs that LSM trees explore, allowing them to essentially wear many different hats and fit a wide variety of applications. One of the issues, though, is that selecting the values of these tuning knobs can essentially make or break your performance, which leads us to the biggest and age-old question: how do we select values for our tuning knobs? To understand this, let's take a look at some of the subset. Take a look at a subset of some the high impact tuning knobs and how it affects an LSM tree, right? So we see an LSM tree. It's normally split into a couple distinct areas, logical levels. So essentially what we label as like buffer, L1, L2, L3, etc. Items in DRAM and items on disk. When we receive any data for an LSM tree, they're generally in key value pairs, and they first start essentially in a buffer that exists on DRAM. Once the buffer is filled, or a particular level is filled, we sort and flush it to disk, creating sorted runs. This is noted as a compaction. Additionally, each sorted run per level, or each level, gets a bloom filter to reduce the number of IOs, and these bloom filters live particularly in DRAM as well. And the ratio between two levels is a tunable knob in what we call the size ratio, and affects essentially how often you compact. Different compaction policies also affect when you compact. Lazily, when a level is full, leading to more sorted runs, like we see above, or you may compact eagerly. So essentially, when runs are flushed straight from buffer, or when runs are flushed from one level to another, you compact it immediately, leading to one large single file. And with that, we essentially have the four knobs that we will be looking at for Endure. And we know that there are like more settings or more knobs that like a lot of different LSM tree implementations will use. But for Endure, we'll focus essentially on these four. Now let's see an LSM tree in action real quickly, right? So if you want to read the value for key 62, we essentially start and take a look at the buffer and check if it's there first, right? And if it's not, we go further down and we'll take a look at our first bloom filter at our first level on disk, right? And because it's a bloom filter, it may say yes, it may say no. And if it says no, we can essentially just trust it and move on, right? If we take a look at a particular filter and it does say yes, we'll end up having to go straight to disk and verify whether or not the object exists. If it doesn't exist, like in this instance here, we'll essentially keep going down the filters. And at some point along this process, we'll get a yes, and we'll actually go to disk and we'll get the correct read, right? So now that we've seen some of these different settings in action, the next question we can ask ourselves is, what assumptions do we tune off of? And for that, we're going to need to take a look at how to define a workload. Now, we have four common types of queries that more or less encompass all of the LSM operations, right? So we'll split our reads into two particular types of reads: empty reads, when a read returns no answer, and non-empty reads, where we return an answer. Range reads, of course, are when a user will ask for something between two bounds, and a write, which may encompass a delete, update, or a new write. And with these query types, we can essentially define a workload as just the frequency of each type, so into a probability vector, right? So cool. We have a workload. We have the knobs that we're looking for. So how do we actually go about tuning, right? So I'm going to define this a bit formally here, the LSM-Tuning problem. So for notation's sake, we have W, which is our workload. Again, the four types of queries. We have phi, which is our LSM tree design, and this is all of the knobs that we were looking at before, and a particular cost function C, right? And we'll get to exactly what you could like use for your cost function. And And the problem that we're always solving is to find a design phi that minimizes your costs C based off of a workload W. For Endure, we're particularly looking at IOs, where we define our costs of the sum of expected IOs per query type weighted by its frequency, right? Cool. So let's take a look at a graphical representation of solving the tuning problem. So here I have a workload visualized in 3D space with our empty and non-empty reads combined. And if we pay attention to our selected workload, the black star, we can draw a cost surface based on the selection of our knobs, right? So in this instance, I have size ratio and filter memory as the two knobs to look at. And we can essentially find the optimal configuration by exploring this cost surface and finding the configuration that gives us the minimum cost value. Of course, every single workload is going to have a slightly different cost surface. So if I take a look at a neighboring workload, some workload that is close to our original expected workload, the cost surface is going to look different, and it's also going to give us a different optimal configuration, right? So this can be very problematic if our initial expected workload that we use for tuning is far off from what we observe when actually deploying our application or deploying our LSM tree. So quick recap, I've talked a bit about LSM trees and the tuning problem, and I'm going to dive a little bit further into Endure now. So tuning in the presence of workload uncertainty, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Endure pipeline and then show some results. So first, I'm going to take, you've seen the slide before. I'm going to name our original problem here the nominal problem, right? So this is the exact same thing where you're finding a design phi that minimizes our cost C based off a particular workload W, right? Now, if I add that green egg-shelled neighborhood that we did before and place some actual formal definitions on it, we can come up with a new problem. So that green region we'll call our uncertainty neighborhood of workloads, a set U, and we'll parameterize U based off of rho, the size of the neighborhood, right? And now with that, we essentially have an analogous problem to our nominal problem. We're still trying to find a design that minimizes our cost. However, we take into consideration all workloads in our uncertainty set U. And for this, we'll call the robust problem. So let's see exactly how a solution from the nominal and the robust differs. So here I have the exact same picture that we've seen before with our two workloads, right? The expected workload W0 in that black star and our neighboring workload that's inside our green region. So a configuration will satisfy the robust problem if, when we take a look and apply the configuration to both workloads and take the highest of the two, that value is minimized, right? But specifically, though, the way that I have the problem phrased, it's not just taking a look at two workloads, it's actually taking a look at all workloads in our neighborhood. So how do we specifically define this workload? Well, we first need to define what it means for two workloads to be far or close away, right? And for this, we use the Kale divergence, specifically because our workloads are probability vectors and Kale divergence is a statistical distance. It fits very well into this application. Next, then, how do we actually create this neighborhood, right? How do we essentially produce the rho value that our neighborhood is parameterized off of, right? So there are kind of two ways that we could do this. We could ask a user to provide historical workloads, and we can take the maximum or average Kale divergence among all workload pairings, or we can ask the user for an exact numerical value. So putting all this together, let's take a look at what the Endure pipeline does, right? So users provide some workload characteristic, an expected workload, and an expected rho. Then we feed that into Endure, additionally with some typical system information like page size. And afterwards, we get a robust configuration. But more importantly, too, we also get an expected performance curve. So based off of our modeling, we can kind of predict, depending on what type of observed workload you may see, how far away your performance would be from nominal. So let's see this in action. So in order to actually test, we implemented Endure in Python, and we implemented it in tandem with RocksDB, so it would work together. And in order to test, we actually need some workloads, right? So we define a benchmark suite composing of 15 different expected workloads broken into different types. The uniform, in which each query type is treated equally. Unimodal, representing instances where a single query type may dominate your workload. Bimodal, where you have two query types that dominate your workload. Trimodal, 3. Additionally, we sample 10,000 random workloads to add to this test suite in order to essentially cover that probability simplex, or have enough workloads to cover all possible types of workloads you would see essentially in that triangle. And lastly, one of the metrics that you'll see here and also in our paper is normalized delta throughput. And we always see it in the form of nominal versus robust. So 0 always indicating that robust is doing better, where the value 1 exactly means a 2x speed up. Cool. So to examine the difference in robust tunings and nominal tunings, we kind of need to first examine the difference in expected versus observed row, right? So on the x-axis here, the expected row is the workload that's actually given to the tuner, right? So this is the row value that defines your neighborhood U. The observed row is the distance from your executed workload to the expected workload that you gave to your tuner. So in this instance, each of the expected workloads are listed on the graph above. And as your observed row increases, essentially you're executing workloads that are further and further away from your expected workload. So if we take a look at this graph, we can kind of see two very clear pictures, right? The highest throughput is observed essentially when your observed and row match, right? So all the way at the top right. And this makes sense. Essentially, this means that when you account for uncertainty in your tunings and your observed workload also has some uncertainty or drifts away from your expected workload, you can actually recover a lot of performance that you wouldn't otherwise have had. On the flip side, the lowest throughput occurs when row is mismatched. Lastly, let's take a look at Endure when deployed on RocksDB. For this, we ran a sequence of workloads divided up into 6 sessions with 5 observation periods per session. So each session here that I've circled one session in red has an average workload listed below. Then if we take a look at a single point, each point is actually 200,000 queries executed on RocksDB. Then in the top right here, each tuning problem, both the nominal and the robust, is given a particular expected workload, in this instance, W7. And then the average of all workloads across all sessions is our actual observed workload, W hat. The expected and observed row in this instance are matched, so this is the ideal case. And as a quick caveat, all writes are unique and range queries are short range queries. So if we take a look at the actual graph to see performance, the black stars represent the nominal tuning and the green circles represent Endure's tuning. And what we can see from the analytical model is that the robust tuning performs actually much better, where the average IOs per query doesn't really fluctuate that much as your workload changes over time. And if we take a look at the actual system measurements, we see the measured IOs essentially mirror the performance from what we expected from the model. And lastly, this IO savings translates very, very well into query latency, right? So we can see an average throughput increase of almost 120%. Note that this is just a small subset of our results. If you'd like, take a look at the paper for a more detailed analysis. Now, thank you all for tuning in. To quickly summarize everything, so workload uncertainties can create suboptimal tunings, especially if your expected workload differs a lot from the workloads you observe in production. Hence, we propose Endure. It's a robust tuning paradigm that takes into consideration workload uncertainty during the tuning process. We deployed Endure in tandem with RocksDB and saw major performance benefits. You can find us at the Disk Lab at Boston University, or otherwise, here's my personal information. My name is Andy. Thank you once again.